By 1922, most of the Middle Eastern borders had been agreed upon. Iraq, Jordan and Hejaz were being ruled over by different members of the Sharifian family. The French took over Syria and Lebanon, Armenia, Georgia and Yerevan were taken over by the Soviets, and Egypt, on paper at least, became an independent country. There was, however, one major ongoing war, the Greco-Turkish War. This had reached a stalemate in late 1921, but Ataturk was able to build up his army in the following months. By August 1922, he had around 90,000 men and launched the Great Offensive. The Turks still had very little in the way of modern vehicles, but still they defeated the Greeks at Dumlimpana in late August, and this battle largely routed the Greeks, opening up the route to the coast. By September the 9th, the Turks entered Izmir, or then known as Smyrna, and this brings us to possibly another genocide committed by the Turks. Deportations of Greeks had already begun in 1913, and violence continued for a while. Greeks beforehand could actually be found across Anatolia, from Izmir and Istanbul in the west to the Cappadocian Greeks and the Pontic Greeks in the east. In Istanbul, Adrianople and Izmir they numbered around 1/3 of the population, but their proportion elsewhere was declining. Like if you include the countryside of the provinces, in Kayseri only 10% were Greek, and in Trabzon only 8% were in 1914. The Germans though managed to prevent the Ottomans from conducting any large-scale massacres, similar to what happened to the Armenians early on. This though was partly a diplomatic move, as it was one of the conditions of Greek neutrality. As the war progressed though, this policy changed, with Talat Pasha ordering Greeks to be deported from the coast. This was often followed by killings and forcible recruitment into labour battalions. Then George W. Rendell reported by 1918, over 500,000 Greeks were deported, of whom comparatively few survived. Rafet Bey also allegedly said to the Austrians, "We must finish off the Greeks as we did with the Armenians. Today I sent squads to the interior to kill every Greek on sight." Some of the Pontic Greeks in the east fought back, forming their own militias and volunteering to serve in the Russian army. Yet, the Greeks did commit atrocities of their own around Izmir, like in Menemen and Izmit, where potentially thousands of Turks were massacred. One Greek, Elias Venices, even reported how Greeks would launch retaliation campaigns, capturing Turkish civilians, gouging out their eyes, or cutting open their skulls with a saw. And then there were many reports of the assault of women, looting villages, and even reports of torture. Like they would hang people upside down and light a fire below them to extract information. The Yalova Peninsula massacres even prompted the Allies to launch a report on the issue, and they reported that there was a systematic plan of destruction and extinction of the Muslim population, and the situation of the Turks in Smyrna city had become what they called, without exaggeration, a reign of terror. Even future Prime Minister Colonel Kondalis seems to have encouraged massacres against the Turks. While at Aden, they killed women and children, burnt down the city, and shot those who fled with machine guns. Or in Usak, they assaulted women inside of a mosque and then set it on fire with people inside. However, the Allied reports also indicated that the Turkish crimes have been considerable and more ferocious than those on the part of the Greeks. Even reporting, the Turkish inhabitants of the occupied zone have, in most cases, accepted the advent of Greek rule without demur, and in some cases undoubtedly prefer it to the nationalist regime, which seems to have been founded on terrorism. But first I'd like to thank Aura for sponsoring this video. Are you tired of constantly receiving spam phone calls to the point where you don't even answer your phone anymore? Well, Aura is here to help. Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live. Well, Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. These brokers are actually legally required to remove your information if you ask them to, they just make it incredibly hard to do so. So, Aura will do it for you. It's really easy to set up, and you can get it for an incredibly reasonable price. So, let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online, while you get on with your life. Don't let people continue exploiting and profiting from your private information. Go to aura.com/jabsy. There, if you're from the USA, you can start your 2-week free trial today. And you can take a look if your personal information has been compromised. Again, that's aura.com/jabsy. But now let's get back to the video. In Thrace, Sturgiadis was able to stop many atrocities from being committed. Yet, in total, some say that 1.5 million Muslims were killed or deported from Greek zones, while some, like R.J. Rummel, said there were only around 15,000 killed. But again, this is a remarkably political issue, so the true number may lie somewhere in the middle. The Greeks on their retreat adopted a scorched earth policy, burning fields and villages and even people, with one Greek officer reporting, "The destruction in the cities and villages through which we passed, the arsons and other ugliness, I am not able to describe, and I prefer that the world remains oblivious to this destruction." On the other side, though, the Turks also continued their campaigns, and many, like Churchill, argued that they were far worse than the Greek atrocities. Or George Horton, the US consul, said, "One of the cleverest statements circulated by Turkish propagandists is to the effect that the massacred Christians were as bad as their executioners, that it was 50-50. For instance, the Turks during the Amasya trials executed many members of the local football team that wore blue and white shirts, and the army under Nuruddin Pasha and irregular forces under Topal Osman continued to deport and massacre much of the population." Or, in one report it said, "The soldiers ran a bayonet through one ear to the other, a long stick was placed through each head, and then the soldiers paraded before the officers with these heads." These two women also saw 4 girls from 15 to 18 years of age taken by officers for immoral purposes, while in Iznik, the British found hundreds of mutilated corpses. Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, the German Chancellor during the war, said, "The indications are that the Turks plan to eliminate the Greek element enemies of the state, as they did earlier with the Armenians." Or Henry Morgenthau, the US ambassador, said the Turks were terrorizing, cruel torturing, driving of women into harems, debauchery of innocent girls, the sale of many of them at 80 cents each, the murdering of hundreds of thousands, and deportation to and starvation in the desert. And it was a scheme to annihilate the Armenian, Greek, and Syrian Christians of Turkey. And they did succeed in all but wiping out the Pontic Greeks, with somewhere between 300,000 and 700,000 being killed, and many more were deported. Throughout all of this period, Ataturk received admiration from the growing Nazi party in Germany. Hans Tropst, Himmler, and Hitler were all keen admirers of Ataturk. Tropst in early Nazi papers would often write about the Turkish methods and national purification. Hitler even wrote to Tropst early on saying, "What you have witnessed in Turkey is what we will have to do in the future as well in order to liberate ourselves." But all of this killing would culminate in the burning of Smyrna, or modern-day Izmir. But who set fire to the city is, once again, disputed. The Greek army had evacuated the city on the 9th of September, and 4 days later, Ataturk arrived. The Greeks, as I mentioned before, had already been torching villagers on their retreat, and even set fire to Manisa a few days earlier, destroying the vast majority of the buildings. The American Vice Consul James Loder Park reported, "The burning of these cities was not desultory, nor intermittent, nor accidental, but well planned and thoroughly organized. It may safely be surmised that the atrocities committed by retiring Greeks numbered well into thousands." However, it does seem that the Turks were responsible for the burning of Smyrna. Turkish mobs had already tortured and lynched the Chrysostomos of the city, who refused to flee with the Greek army. Then an American, Miss Minnie Mills, said, "I saw with my own eyes a Turkish officer enter the house with small tins of petroleum and benzine, and in a few minutes the house was in flames." But she wasn't the only person who would back up this version of events. The fire also did begin in the Armenian quarter and quickly spread, while the Cathedral of St. Fotini was blown up with dynamite. Many Greeks and Armenians were then cordoned within the fire zone, and the Turks prevented many ships from aiding the refugees trying to flee by sea. The defeated Greek government, meanwhile, were in the midst of a revolution, so they could not help. Some foreign ships, including a Japanese one, did help out, rescuing anywhere between 50,000 and 200,000 people. Another 20 to 100,000, though, were deported into the interior of Anatolia, and around the same numbers died within the city. Yet this fire largely marked the end of the violence, as the two governments agreed, controversially, to exchange their populations. 400,000 Muslims living in Greece were sent to Turkey, and 1.2 million Greeks in Turkey were moved over to Greece. Fridtjof Nansen was the architect of the scheme, and as a supporter of the Armenians and Christians in Turkey, he believed that this was the best solution. However, many people have called it a mutual ethnic cleansing. Plus, the exchange wasn't based on ethnicity, it was a religious exchange. So Greek Muslims like the Valahais, and even many Roman people, were told to move to Turkey, while Armenians joined the Greeks leaving Turkey. Greeks inside of Istanbul were allowed to stay, but this meant that only 700,000 Christians remained in all of Turkey. Before the war they numbered 4.4 million, or 20% of the population. By 1927 it was around 5%, and today it's less than 0.5%. While in Greece cities like Thessaloniki were once predominantly Jewish, but now it's mainly Greek. It was planned that the possessions left behind would be compensated for. But in Turkey, many of the Greek homes were looted and towns like Kayaköy were left abandoned. Then a lot of the abandoned land and homes were taken over by the government and sold to make some money. Plus, the numbers and types of immigrants provided more issues. For instance, many Muslims in Greece had been peasant farmers, while many Greeks in Turkey had been businessmen. So it's estimated that Turkey lost up to 90% of their commercial class, and this potentially allowed them to become more authoritarian. While the new arrivals in Greece were middle class, and were more likely to be Republican and staunchly loyal to Venizelos and opposed to the monarchy. So violence often broke out between them and the locals, who were more royalist. Greece also only had around 5 million people, and now they had to find room for another 1 million. Some were sent to Macedonia, but many more were put into squalid shantytowns, and here their children began to develop communist sympathies as they grew up. The Turks, though, continued to pass reforms targeting the Greeks that stayed. Like in the 1930s, they banned them from holding certain jobs, like in law, and later there would be a number of pogroms. But as of yet, Ataturk had not taken Istanbul. He continued to reiterate, "Our demands remain the same after our recent victory, as they were before. We ask for Asia Minor, Thrace up to the river of Marista and Constantinople. We must have our capital. I much prefer to obtain possession by negotiation, though naturally I cannot wait indefinitely." However, British troops still remained around the capital to enforce the previous treaties. So the nationalists began to prepare for an attack. Even Ernest Hemingway reported, "Another night a destroyer stopped a boatload of Turkish women who were crossing from Asia Minor. On being searched for arms, it turned out that all the women were men. They were all armed and later proved to be Kemalist officers." Meanwhile, Raymond Poincaré had already ordered that the French leave to Chanak, while the British coalition government was divided on the issue. Churchill, for instance, said, "If the Turks take the Gallipoli Peninsula and Constantinople, we shall have lost the whole fruits of our victory, and another Balkan war would be inevitable." But many objected to fight a war to defend the Sultan and the Balkans. Churchill then sent a telegram to Mackenzie, King of Canada, asking for troops. This almost caused a huge diplomatic incident within the British Empire, as Canada was poised to ignore the British requests and therefore embark on their own foreign diplomacy. In the end, in late September, the British just told the Greeks to leave and Eastern Thrace became Turkish. By this point, though, the Allies were already negotiating a new treaty with the Turks at Lausanne. In it, most of the modern-day borders were established with a couple of exceptions, and the Turks had to cede all claims to the Dodecanese, Cyprus, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. They also agreed that the Straits should be demilitarized, but this would change in the 1930s. However, the Turks would later claim lands in many of these places, and a lot of this came down to the Misak-i Milli, or the National Oath of 1920. This declaration, which was made by the defeated Ottomans, set the border to what they believed to be Turkey. Whether or not this was passed in Parliament, though, is unknown, but the concept has been brought up more recently. Erdogan, for instance, said, "Turkey is not just Turkey. Certain historians believe that the borders set by the national contract, in addition to the current Turkish border, include Cyprus, Aleppo, Mosul, Erbil, Kirkuk, Batumi, Thessaloniki, Kardzali, Varna, and the islands of the Aegean, forming the basis of what we'd call Neo-Ottomanism." But going back to the conference, The Allies had invited the Sultan to attend. However, in November 1922, the Grand National Assembly, centered in Ankara, declared that the Sultanate was abolished, ending the Ottoman Empire. The conference at Lausanne therefore confirmed that Ataturk was the legal representative of the new Turkish Republic, and Mehmed VI departed from Istanbul shortly afterwards. But the House of Osman still held the title of Caliph. In November 1922, Abdul-Majid was given this title in Ankara to serve in a ceremonial role, uniting Muslims around the world. Ataturk, however, declared, "Your office, the Caliphate, is nothing more than a historic relic. It has no justification for existence." But around the world, Muslims still celebrated the Caliph. Like in India, Muslims formed the Khilafat movement in support. This could have provided challenges for the new Turkish Republic, so in 1924, the title of Caliph was also abolished. There were, of course, other reasons for this. As Ataturk said, "The Turkish army will have done its duty when it defends the country from foreign aggression, and frees the nation from fanaticism and intellectual slavery." He then set out on a huge campaign of reforms to make the nation a secular one, almost a radically secular one. His main ideas, though, were summarized with 6 arrows, which formed the basis of Kemalism. These were republicanism, populism, nationalism, secularism, statism, and reformism. These vague notions, though, are very hard to pin down, and his policies were praised by both the Bolsheviks and Nazis alike. Some in the Islamic world also celebrated his achievements, but disagreed with the abolition of the Caliphate, and they looked for a new one to lead them. The Sharif of Mecca quickly tried to take the title for himself, but received no support. Then, allegedly, Ataturk offered the title to Ahmed Sharif of the Senussi movement, if he would remain outside of Turkey. But his old ally in battles against the Italians refused the title. Other possible candidates included Ibn Saud, King Fuad of Egypt, and even Amanullah Khan of Afghanistan, who had just fought against the British. International conferences were held in Indonesia, Cairo, and Jerusalem to try and pick a new caliph. But, just taking Cairo in 1926 as an example, many didn't support Fuad as their king, let alone their caliph. So a rival conference sent delegates to Mecca. Or in 1931, al-Husseini helped organize a conference in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was at the time seen as neutral territory, and it could have been a new center of Islam. Plus, if the caliph was in Jerusalem, they could have more fiercely opposed Zionism. But again, nothing came of this. There was, though, another contender, Sazadi Mehmed Selim, the son of Abdul Hamid II. He was living in exile in French Syria, and he became the center of a plot to remove Ataturk from power. However, to understand this, we also need to look at the Sheikh Zayed rebellion in Kurdish lands. The Kurds were once again trying to establish their own state, led by the likes of Abdul Qadir Abdullah and Nuri Dasimi. Around Dersim, they raided warehouses, and by late 1920, they made their demands, including the withdrawal of Turkish troops from Kurdish lands. By 1921, though, Ataturk sent Nuruddin Pasha to deal with them. He was so brutal that even those in the Turkish government were shocked, and he was removed from his post. The opposition to Ataturk continued to grow in Kurdish lands, though, especially as he was deemed to be anti-religious. Ataturk, meanwhile, feared losing even more lands, and realized the problem of even allowing Kurds to have freedom in Iraq, saying the British wanted to establish a Kurdish state there in northern Iraq. If they do, this thought spreads to the Kurds within our own borders. To prevent this, we need to cross the border south. But the Kurds began to organize a secret society known as the Azadi. At their first congress in 1924, many former commanders of the Hamidiyya cavalry were present, and so too was Sheikh Zayed, and together they decided to rebel. Kurdish soldiers mutinied under Khalid Beg Shibram, but they were quickly suppressed. The Turks then began rounding up Azadi leaders, so Sheikh Zayed appealed to all Muslims to join him, and around 15,000 people did so. They created a new Kurdish state and laid siege to Diyarbakir. But there, under machine gun fire and aerial bombardment, the rebellion was largely crushed. Many were sentenced to death, and once again, the Turks looked to eradicate a possible threat to their rule. In this case, the Report for Reform of the East said, "Forbid both the use of non-Turkish languages and the employment of Kurds in second-level offices." Then resettlement, martial law and more would try to Turkify the Kurdish populations. As Ismet Inonu said, "We are frankly nationalists, and nationalism is our only factor of cohesion. At any price we must Turkify the inhabitants of our land, and we will annihilate those who oppose." But going back to Selim, as it was during this revolt that the rebels actually proclaimed him to be their new caliph. However, he really had nothing to do with the rebellion and lived peacefully in exile. Otherwise, this rebellion also allowed the law for maintenance of order to be passed, giving the government further powers. This, along with the abolition of the caliphate, angered many. They founded the Progressive Republican Party, which wasn't necessarily opposed to the ideals of Kemalism, but rather its implementation. Ataturk, however, disbanded the party regardless, and many fled into exile. Some within this party were even accused of plotting to assassinate Ataturk in 1926 in Izmir. Many old party members were accused of working with the Kurds or Islamists, including the founder of the CUP, Mehmet Kavid, and were either exiled or killed. Ataturk was then free to proceed on his secularization campaigns, closing down Islamic courts, desegregating men and women, and discouraging the veil. The Turkish language was also switched over to the Latin alphabet. The following education campaigns helped double literacy rates from 10% to 20% by 1940. Other reforms may have seemed quite trivial, but they resulted in deaths. Like he wanted Turks to wear more European hats, so passed a law banning the fez in 1925. In Erzurum, Maraş, Riza and elsewhere, people protested against it, martial law was declared, and people were executed. However, despite his calls for republicanism, he had transformed Turkey into a one-nation state, and a cult of personality was born. His name, after all, was Mustafa Kemal, but this was changed to Ataturk, or the Father of the Turks. And even today, insulting Ataturk has been made a criminal offence. There were some challenges to this one-party system, like in 1930 when the Liberal Republican Party was allowed to form. This was after the stock market crash brought chaos around the world, and in Turkey, there were plans to change from the statist economy to a more liberal one. However, this party soon became the centre of all opposition within Turkey, and in Menemen, further disturbances would break down the multi-party system again. Here, people from the Naqshbandi school of Islam organised a protest against secularism. They then shot soldiers and even beheaded one. While over in Kurdish lands, the situation had never really been settled. Like Ibrahim Heski from the Jalali tribe, had continued to resist Turkish encroachment. But an even greater threat emerged in Lebanon, where exiled Kurds founded a new group known as Hoybun. They returned back to Turkey and declared independence for the Republic of Ararat. Their small army around Mount Arafat held out for a while, but by 1930 Turkish planes were bombing their position in Kurdish villages, and even again more massacres were committed, like at Zilan, where 15,000 people were killed. Even Turkish papers reported, "Cleaning started. The ones at Zelan Valley were completely annihilated." The Kurds were quickly forced to surrender, while Ataturk became convinced again that the new Liberal Party were working with the Islamists and the Kurds, so again had them disbanded. There was therefore no democracy in his republic, but in his defence he said, "Republic means the democratic administration of the state. It should enforce all the requirements of democracy as the time comes." This justification allowed Turkey to remain a one-party state. Ataturk also became more concerned about the Turks' pre-Islamic history, believing that they were tied to the ancient Hittites and a new racial theory around the Turks. This was as bold and as inaccurate as the Nazis' Aryan idea, but in short, they believed that the Turks came from Central Asia thousands of years ago, and they helped create the Indus Valley Civilization, China, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and even Rome. As in the main book on the topic, An Outline of Turkish History said, the true natives had no civilization. This book, by the way, was also taught in schools. However, Ataturk never allowed Enver Pasha to return to Turkey, despite his pan-Turkish beliefs. Enver had first fled to Germany, and then was asked by Hans von Seeckt to negotiate a Soviet-German alliance in 1920. He even appeared at the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku, hoping to rally the people to the Bolshevik side. However, he was seen as a destructive figure by Ataturk and a personal rival, so he was never allowed to return home. Instead, Vladimir Lenin sent Enver to Central Asia to meet with the leaders of the Basmachi revolt. They had been rebelling against Russian rule ever since 1916, opposed to conscription, corruption, and the arrival of even more Russian settlers. The Tsar, however, responded brutally, leaving over 200,000 dead through massacres or disease. Many more would flee to China, where they would die on the way. Then, when the Tsar was toppled, many of the Muslims in the region began to unite under the Jadids. These were Muslim scholars who had tried to modernize in order to protect Islam. They had first tried to align with the Bolsheviks, but the Tashkent Soviet prevented Muslims from participating in government. So instead, they aligned with more conservative Islamist leaders and formed a new government in Kokand. The Red Army had already carried out massacres in Kokand in early 1918, encouraging further uprisings under the command of Ergash Bey, who declared himself the supreme leader of the Islamic army. There were also the remnants of the once powerful Central Asian states under Russian rule, like Khiva and Bukhara. The Red Army, though, moved into these states and deposed their leaders. But Sayyid Alim Khan of Bukhara continued to lead his men from Afghanistan, and Junaid Khan fled with his Khivan forces to Khorasan. These leaders formed the basis of the Basmachi movement. Then Enver Pasha arrived in late 1921 to initially help quell these rebellions. But he quickly defected and tried to unite the various movements into one state. His calls for jihad encouraged many to join him, including those from Western China. So there was a possibility of creating a huge Turkic state. However, no help came, and Enver was killed in August 1922 in a cavalry charge into machine guns. Many of the fighters would cross into Afghanistan, which would fall into chaos once more. But first, in neighbouring Persia, another dynasty would also fall. Here, Reza Pahlavi had marched into the capital, probably with British support, and demanded a new prime minister be appointed. This was Zia al-Din Tabatabai. He, however, proved to be incredibly unpopular as he tried to make too many reforms. He also made the Shah angry by ignoring royal protocols and nearly oversaw the breakup of the country. For instance, he sent Colonel Persian to arrest the governor of Khorasan, Ahmad Kavam, who he believed was his opponent. Colonel Persian, by the way, was a very popular leader, as he had opposed the Allies during World War I. However, back in Tehran, Zia was told to resign in May 1921, but there was no one who would accept the title of Prime Minister, except for Ahmad Kavan. He was released from prison and tried to remove Colonel Persian from Khorasan. Persian's autonomous government tried to fight back, but Kavam had the support of Reza and many tribal leaders. So by the end of the year, Persian was beheaded and his head was placed in the capital. On the opposite side of the country, Khuzestan was also virtually an independent state. Here, Sheikh Khazal was supported by the British, and in return, he allowed them to exploit the oil in the region. But in July 1922, Reza dispatched a small force to try and bring the Sheikh back into the fold. The Sheikh, though, had already formed an alliance of sorts with the Bakhtiari tribal leaders, and they attacked Reza's army. The Bakhtiaris claimed it was all a misunderstanding, but Reza was determined to get his revenge. However, we'll leave this one for now, as in the north, there was yet another rebellion. Simko Shakak, who had fought against the Assyrians during World War I, now had a force of 20,000 Kurds, and with them, he took over Urmia and the surrounding lands. Then he pushed on to cities like Baner and Sardasht by 1922. Reza Pahlavi responded quickly, and at the Battle of Saritaj, he forced him into exile in Turkey. However, he would soon return in 1926. Now, though, with the Kurds defeated, Reza could move south. But first, Ahmed Shah Qajar set off on a tour of Europe in November 1923, and before he left, he discussed with Khazal the threats that Reza Pahlavi posed to the nation. For instance, Reza had pressured Parliament to award him dictatorial powers and a new title of His Serene Highness. With the Shah's blessing, Khazal gathered together an alliance of tribal and religious leaders into the Committee of the Rising for Happiness. They demanded Reza Pahlavi step down to allow the Shah to return, and the restoration of traditional rights and return to constitutionalism. In return, Sheikh Khazal was issued an ultimatum to hand over his possessions to the government. He refused and tried to gain some international support, even going to the League of Nations to gain recognition for his state. Reza then ignored Britain's calls for peace and invaded, forcing Khazar to accept Reza's rule. Then, in April 1925, Reza arrested Khazar, liquidated his possessions, and abolished the emirate. With all of the rebellions crushed, Reza returned to Tehran and pressured Parliament to officially depose the Shah, who was still in Europe. There was some debate as to whether or not he would transform the country into a republic like Ataturk had done, but instead he took the crown for himself, becoming Reza Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. Much like Ataturk though, he was a reformer and almost a radical secularist. Like in 1936, he would actually ban women wearing the hijab, and those who wore it in public could be beaten. Otherwise, there were huge infrastructure projects like the Trans-Iranian Railway, and thousands of kilometers of highway were also built. Like with Ataturk, schooling became incredibly important, with it being free and compulsory for both boys and girls. Religious authorities were diminished, their land was taken away, and he even broke into a shrine in Qom to beat a cleric who criticized the Shah's wife for showing her face. So many people did oppose these reforms. In 1935, in the Imam Reza shrine in Mashhad, a cleric decided to lead some protests. But Reza just called in the Azeris to break into the shrine and crush them. Meanwhile, in the capital, power was also taken away from Parliament through his constant removal of prominent ministers. And tribes also lost their power when he created a brand new centralized army of over 100,000 men. But to do this, he had to rapidly increase military spending. Yet, many tribes were forced to accept centralized control for the first time and a sedentary lifestyle, meaning Reza Shah had actually managed to cement his control. However, going back to Afghanistan, King Amanullah had previously fought against the British and, on paper, managed to secure his country's independence. He then brought in Mahmud Tarzi to his government. Now, previously Tarzi's family had been exiled, but this just allowed him to travel around the world, going to Mecca and Paris, and meeting many of the great intellectuals of the late 19th century, like Al-Afghani. When he was invited back in the early 20th century, he began to publish his own newspaper, advocating for a secular, modern nation with a constitutional monarch. He was then made foreign minister after the Third Anglo-Afghan War, and helped draft the first constitution of Afghanistan. In fact, he officially turned the country into a kingdom, hoping to unite the tribes. Plus, to further unify the nation, the old official language of Dari was slowly replaced by Pashto. They also constructed new schools, allowing boys and girls to attend, and liberalized the laws on dress codes for women. Further gender reforms were also championed by his Syrian wife, Soraya Tarzi. There was, however, again, almost immediate backlash. Like in 1923, in Alizai, the people rose up to fight against taxation and conscription. And in Khost the following year, the people were angered by modernization, taxation, and his cultural reforms. For instance, the abolition of child marriage and the freedoms for women. The British consul then reported, with the new code in one hand and the Quran in the other, they called the tribes to choose between the word of God and that of man, the acceptance of which would reduce their sons to slavery in the Afghan army and their daughters to the degrading influence of Western education. In Kabul, Amanullah called an assembly of nobles, known as the Jirga, hoping to get support. But they also denounced his modernization reforms, and to make matters worse, Abd al-Karim arrived in Afghanistan from India. He was the son of Muhammad Yaqub Khan, who had ruled Afghanistan for a very short time at the end of the Second Anglo-Afghan War. And now Abd al-Karim was claiming the throne for himself. The king, though, did have some allies, like the Kogyani, the Shinwari, and Babrak Khan, the leader of the Zadran tribes. And on Babrak Khan, interestingly, his sons would go on to lead rebellions in 1944 and assassinate the first Prime Minister of Pakistan. With their support, the king declared a holy war on the rebels, claiming that they were British agents, while the British and the Soviets blamed each other for the rebellion. The king then launched campaigns in the south, forcing Abd al-Karim to flee once again to India. The population was then subject to reprisals, as there were mass executions, women were kidnapped, and villages were torched. Internationally, the king then clashed with the Soviets over the small river island of Urutagai. In November 1925, the Basmachi rebels were using it as a base for raids, so a couple hundred Soviets landed on the island and chased them out. The Afghans, however, claimed it as their own and demanded the Soviets withdraw, even deploying their own forces to the north. After some international arbitration, the Soviets did withdraw in exchange for the Afghans promising to stop Basmachi border raids. Now, with some degree of peace, Amanullah continued on his reforms. Like he managed to create a small air force, and culturally, he even brought back books about the Baha'i faith, leading many to believe that he wasn't a true Muslim. Then, in 1927, he also went on a tour of Europe, visiting Mussolini, Pilsudski, George V, and many others. It was actually on this tour that he adopted the tricolour flag, after being inspired by Weimar Germany. However, ever since the Kost Rebellion, Amanullah spent even more money on his army, depleting his limited funds. And the old leaders were angry that they were being replaced by a younger generation, often those who had been educated in Europe. So in Jalalabad in November 1928, the Shinwari Pashtuns rose up, demanding an end to the secular reforms. And they were joined by many of the king's soldiers. Tribesmen from across the country began pouring into the capital, hoping to take part in the campaigns against the rebels. This was mainly, though, because they sought loot, as many like the Mongols had previously fought against the king. This forced the rebels in Jalalabad to put down their arms. But the situation grew a lot worse elsewhere, as Habibullah Kalakani, a Tajik bandit, marched south. He had previously aided the Basmachi in Central Asia, and now he moved into Jabal al-Siraj. His small band of followers appointed him emir, and again, many of the king's soldiers mutinied rather than fight against them. Other tribes then joined in, like the Waziri, the Mongol, and the Ahmadzai, and they threatened to take over the capital. With the situation spiraling out of control, Amanullah abdicated in January in favour of his elder brother Inayatullah Khan. But Kalkani, the bandit, proceeded to advance again, with a tiny force of just a couple dozen men. Some Hazaras joined them en route, leading the new king to join his brother in exile in British India. In its final act, the king even declared to Kalakani, "I have decided to relinquish my claim to the Afghan emirate and give you my oath of allegiance, like other true-believing Muslims." So now this Tajik bandit was the new emir of Afghanistan. His followers were known as the Sakhawists, and they quickly allowed the Basmachi rebels to set up base in northern Afghanistan. While at home, they began to launch campaigns of terror against their enemies, especially the Shia Muslims. As one chronicler reported, their forces met a Shia civilian, and the list of crimes included ransacking the Sayyid's belongings and seizing his wives and children. Tearing an 8-month-old son from its mother, he grabbed the baby by the feet and threw him to the ground. There were, however, those that still remained loyal to the deposed king, like Ali Ahmad Khan. He had stayed in Jalalabad since ending the rebellion there, and he was proclaimed the new emir. However, the Kugyani tribe betrayed him for money, and he was quickly executed. Others also refused to swear allegiance to the new emir, like the Hazara and the Wazir, until a series of demands were met, like for instance the protection of their property. They then ambushed Kalakani's men when they passed through their lands, and even more joined in the fight against him. So by this point the country had descended into complete tribal warfare, and allegiances changed remarkably quickly. Sensing an opportunity in March 1929, Amanullah returned to lead the rebel tribes in reclaiming the country. They clashed around Ghazni and continued to fight for a few months. Then to the north, the Soviets also got involved, hoping to put Amanullah back on the throne and crush the Basmachi rebels. They sent a small force into Mazar-e-Sharif, disguised as a local army. But the Afghans quickly found out who they were, declared a jihad on the invaders, and besieged the Soviets within the city. Russian reinforcements were brought in to break the siege and move on to Balkh, where they fought back the Basmachi rebels led by Ibrahim Bek. But to the south, Amanullah's forces were slowly being defeated, and he was forced to withdraw. Now the Soviets had no real basis to be in the country, so they too pulled out. However, then yet another challenger came, Muhammad Nadir Shah. He was the descendant of Sultan Muhammad Khan, the brother of Dost Muhammad. He had grown up in India as the exiled descendant of Sultan Muhammad Khan, the brother of Dost Muhammad. Now though, he saw his opportunity, and with a band of loyal tribes, marched north, and after some heavy fighting in the streets, he captured Kabul. Yet to keep many of the tribes on his side, he allowed them to loot the city for a few days. Kalakani was then executed, while his followers retreated to Herat, but they too were wiped out in the following years. Nadir then quickly tried to mend relations with the Soviets. To do this, he needed to remove Ibrahim Beg and the Basmachi from his lands, so a joint Soviet-Afghan army marched on their base. On their way, however, the Red Army torched many villages nearby to finally eliminate the threat. The Bolsheviks had also largely destroyed the movement in Central Asia by this point and created new Soviets in the region. There would be a few more Basmachi attacks up until 1934, led by Junaid Khan, but really, this ended the hopes for independence in the region. Junaid Khan would then join Sayyid Ali Khan, the old Emir of Bukhara, in exile in Kabul. However, in Kabul, many people expected Nadir to peacefully hand over power to Amanullah, and they were shocked when he decided to keep the throne for himself. Amanullah therefore remained in exile, travelling around Europe looking for allies, and he would later become key to many Nazi plans for the country. While back home, many loyalists would continue to start rebellions over the next decade or so. Nadir Shah, on the other hand, had brought back many of the more conservative laws to Afghanistan in order to appease the religious and tribal leaders. Plus, followers of the more radical Deobandi movement in modern-day Pakistan had been spreading their ideology within Afghanistan. However, this caused further division in the country. They also promoted pan-Islamism, which completely undermined any real attempts to create a sense of national unity. And keep in mind, Afghanistan was still a divided nation, made up of Tajiks, Amaks, Hazaras and more. Some wanted to unify the Pashtun in both Pakistan and Afghanistan, but Abdul Ghaffar Khan believed no revolutionary ideas could be present in the minds of the independent tribes of Afghanistan. He, by the way, was the founder of his own movement, which hoped to achieve independence through non-violent means. Plus, I should also mention that Afghanistan had for centuries a large Hindu population, but with the rise of the Deobandi movement and more Islamist leadership, their numbers continued to decline. Nadir Shah, though, wouldn't rule for very long. In 1933, his brother was assassinated in Germany by an Afghan student who was angry with the king's cooperation with the British. And a couple months later, the king would be assassinated himself. The assassin was Abdul Khalik, a Hazara student. Nobody can agree what his motives were, but it's likely he was angry with the persecution of his people, arrest of his family, or even increased taxes. He was mutilated before being killed, alongside most of his family, and then even some of his classmates, who were just punished as a group. Amanullah from Rome reportedly said, "We have lost so many Afghans by murder and execution, and so many youths and intellectuals have been butchered that I am glad he is gone." Here, by the way, he's referring to the old king. But he refused to make any move. Others did though, like Fakir of Ipi, nicknamed Crazy Fakir. He was from Waziristan, which continued to lay outside the control of Britain, and therefore was filled with guerrilla fighters and bandits. It is said that if the people here united, they could well have been one of the largest armies in the world, as in 1940, the British reported that they had over 400,000 fighting men and 250,000 rifles. This would make them much larger than the Indian army. Crazy Fakir, though, could have been such a unifier. Many of his followers believed that he could perform miracles like turning trees into rifles and turning bombs into paper. And as he continued to fight against the British, in 1933 he crossed into Afghanistan, hoping to restore Amanullah to the throne. He arrived in Khost, but was driven back across the border. There he continued to escape the British, earning him the nickname the Scarlet Pimpernel of Waziristan. And during the next war, Axis agents would seek him out, hoping to fund a large-scale uprising. There would also be other rebellions, like in 1938, a strange figure from Syria appeared in the mountains. He was known as the Shami Pir, and he preached some form of pan-Islamism and declared his support for Amanullah. It seems that the British were just able to pay him to leave the region and go back to Syria. They then investigated the idea that he was sponsored by the Germans or Italians with the hopes of restoring the old monarch, but no real evidence of this exists. The throne therefore had passed on to Muhammad Zahir Shah with some trouble, but in comparison to before, a lot more peacefully. He also inherited a somewhat developed state with an army of 40,000 or so soldiers. But he was still young. So his uncle Muhammad Hashim Khan took over the running of the country, and he would quickly look to forming an alliance with Nazi Germany.